The early 13th century. Across the wide plains stretching from the Volga to the Carpathians, the land of Rus, ancestor of today's Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, lived in fragile peace. Once united under the dynasty of Rurik, the realm had splintered into rival principalities. Kiev, the mother of Rus's cities, still gleamed with ancient glory, yet its power had long faded, scattered among princes of Galicia, Vladimir, and Chernigov. No one in those lands could imagine that. Far to the east, a storm was gathering, one that would soon sweep everything away. Beyond the horizon, under the command of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire was devouring the world. After crushing the Tanguts and the Khwarezmians, the great Khan sent two of his finest generals, Subutai and Jebe, on a long-range mission westward. Their orders were simple: pursue the fleeing Khwarezmians, scout unknown lands, and map the edge of the world. Around the year 1220, they set out with roughly 70,000 elite horsemen, a force small by Mongol standards, yet terrifyingly efficient. They rode across the Aral Sea, through the Caucasus, smashed the Georgian armies, and followed the steppe trail north toward the mysterious forests of Russes. It was the first time Mongol hooves touched Ukrainian soil. The nomadic Cumans, who lived between the Mongols and the Rus, were the first to see them, a black tide moving like wind over the plains. Terrified, they fled westward, dragging their herds behind them. Their chieftain, Khotin, galloped straight to Kiev to beg for help. "A storm is coming from the east," he warned. "If they take our pastures today, they will take your cities tomorrow." His words sounded like distant thunder, but the princes of Russes were skeptical. Suspicious of one another, they believed the Cumans were exaggerating to win allies. Only one man took the warning seriously, Mstislav Mstislavich, called Mstislav the Bold, Prince of Galicia. He had fought alongside the Cumans before and knew their fear was real. He urged the other princes to unite, and after heated debate in Kiev's council hall, they agreed, reluctantly, to march together. Thus, a shaky alliance was born. The forces of Kiev, Galicia, Chernigov, Polotsk, and about 5,000 Cuman horsemen. None of them understood they were riding to face two of the greatest military minds in history, Subutai and Jebe. Men who had crushed empires twice their size. In the spring of 1223, the Allied army rode east across the endless steppe. Peasants lined the roads, crossing themselves and praying for victory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Mongol scouts watched silently. Soon, messengers returned. The enemy was near the Kalka River, a tributary of the Donetsk. The Mongols were retreating, or so it seemed. Their banners vanished over the hills, as if they were fleeing in panic. But this was the oldest trick in Subutai's book, a feigned retreat, the bait for a deadly trap. The Rus alliance broke formation. Impatient and overconfident, Mstislav the Bold and his Cuman allies charged ahead, while Mstislav of Kiev lagged behind, trying to rally the slower infantry. The Cumans, swift and impulsive, pursued the retreating enemy deep into the steppe. Then, without warning, the steppe came alive. From low ridges on both sides, tens of thousands of Mongol horsemen erupted, loosing volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. The air filled with the hiss of fletching and the screams of men and horses. The ground shook beneath the thunder of hooves. The Battle of the Kalka River had begun, a slaughter that would haunt Russes for generations. The Allied ranks dissolved into chaos. The Cumans, realizing the trap, broke and fled, trampling their own allies. The princes of Russes shouted orders no one could hear. Subutai's forces encircled them with perfect precision, one ring of steel closing upon another. By afternoon, the Kalka plain had become a field of death. Entire units were cut down where they stood. The few survivors tried to flee across the river, only to drown beneath the weight of their armor. When the sun set, the grass was red. The Mongols had killed thousands. The rest lay scattered in terrified retreat. 30 Rus princes and nobles were captured alive, including Mstislav Romanovich of Kiev. Subutai spared them no mercy. According to chronicles, the Mongols laid the princes on the ground, placed wooden planks over their bodies, and held a victory feast upon them, singing, drinking, and dancing as their captives slowly suffocated beneath their weight. It was not only punishment, it was a message to all of Rus. Resist us, and you will die in agony. News of the disaster raced westward faster than any rider. Kiev fell into mourning, churches filled with wailing women and the tolling of bells. The chronicles called it the Day of God's Wrath. No one could remember an enemy so swift, so disciplined, so merciless. And yet, after this terrible victory, the Mongols did not stay. Subutai and his surviving troops turned east, crossing the Volga, their mission of reconnaissance complete. His comrade Jebe would die on the return march, but Subutai carried home something far more valuable than loot: knowledge. He brought maps, routes, reports of rivers, forests, fortresses, and fertile lands. He had learned exactly how to conquer Russes. Back in the Mongol heartland, Subutai stood before Genghis Khan and reported all he had seen. He spoke of the wide rivers, the wooden towns, the undisciplined princes. The great Khan listened, then said quietly, "When the time comes, the West will fall as the East has fallen." It was a prophecy that would come true within 2 decades. For now, the Russes could only mourn. They built wooden crosses at Kalka, held vigils for the slain, and prayed that the horsemen of the East would never return. But as the seasons passed, memories faded. Old rivalries flared again. The princes resumed their feuds. They convinced themselves that perhaps it had all been a single, terrible accident, that the men from the steppe would never come back. They were wrong. In the silent plains beyond the Volga, Subutai was already planning. He studied his maps, noted the weaknesses of every city and river crossing, and waited for the next Khan to give the order. 15 years later, he would return, not as a scout, but as the architect of the greatest invasion Eastern Europe had ever seen. But in that spring of 1223, the Russes people knew only loss. Along the Kalka River, the fields lay littered with broken armor and the bones of men and horses. The water ran dark for days. Travelers said that when the wind blew across the plain, you could still hear the echo of hooves, the ghostly thunder of the Mongol vanguard, galloping westward into history. The fields of Kalka had long grown over with grass. To travelers passing by, the land seemed peaceful again, the bones buried, the scars erased by time. But beneath that silence, something inside Russes had changed forever. The princes returned to their cities, or what was left of them, carrying memories of terror and humiliation. The alliance forged before the battle dissolved in weeks. Instead of unity, suspicion took its place. Each prince blamed another for the defeat. Mstislav of Galicia accused the Cumans of cowardice. Kiev's surviving nobles whispered that their Galician cousins had rushed into battle without waiting for orders. In Chernigov, old men muttered that God had punished the pride of the southern princes. The land that needed unity most now fell into a maze of quarrels, claims, and rivalries. In Kiev, the once proud mother city of Rus still stood, but her crown was cracked. The Grand Prince no longer commanded obedience from the others. Vladimir looked north, Galicia looked west, and no one looked toward the horizon where the steppe began. The council halls echoed not with plans of defense, but with endless disputes over trade routes, over tribute, over who should marry whose daughter. The wounds of Kalka might have united them. Instead, they deepened the divisions. Yet life, stubborn as the Dnieper River, went on. Villages rebuilt their burned churches. Merchants reopened markets along the trade roads. In the countryside, peasants plowed the same soil that had once been soaked in blood. The princes ordered new fortifications, wooden walls replaced with stone, moats widened, gates reinforced with iron bands. Smiths worked day and night forging swords and arrowheads, while farmers brought grain to the granaries just in case. A quiet determination filled the air, not courage exactly, but a will to survive. Still, the memory of the Mongols lingered like a shadow. Bards told stories of the horsemen who came and vanished like smoke. Priests preached that the invasion had been God's punishment for sin. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by whispering, "Be good, or the men from the east will come for you." And then, nothing. No riders on the horizon. No smoke on the steppe. Years passed, 15 of them. During those years, the Mongols were silent, too silent. But silence, as the Russes would learn, can be deadlier than noise. In the early years after Kalka, small groups of horsemen appeared at the frontier. Emissaries, not warriors. They carried no banners of war, only scrolls and gifts, furs, silk, fine horse tack. They asked for trade, for envoys, for friendship. The princes of Rus debated what it meant. Some saw it as a sign of peace. Others smelled the trap behind the smiles. A few, hoping to buy safety, sent tribute, silver-path falcons, rare cloth, to the strangers beyond the Volga. A few even dispatched envoys to the Mongol camps, carrying humble letters of goodwill. The emissaries rarely returned. Those who did came back pale and shaken, speaking of an empire so vast it made Rus look like a single village. But as the years went by with no further attacks, complacency took root. The younger princes, who had been children during the disaster at Kalka, began to doubt the stories of their fathers. Perhaps those riders were just another steppe tribe, they said, come and gone like so many before. Some even mocked the old soldiers who still woke in the night from nightmares of hooves and arrows. In that false comfort, Russes began to rebuild. Military drills returned to the fields. Each principality raised its own levy. In the forests near Suzdal, men trained with axes and bows. On the plains of Galicia, cavalry practiced charges and feigned retreats, ironically imitating the tactics of their old enemy. Yet their training was fragmented. No common command, no unified strategy. Each prince imagined himself the future savior of Russes, and none could bear to take orders from another. They were preparing for war, but each was preparing alone. Meanwhile, across the Carpathians, Europe was watching. In the courts of Hungary and Poland, rumors of the horsemen still circulated like ghost stories. Traders from the east spoke of cities destroyed, of rivers choked with corpses. King Bela of Hungary ordered new fortresses along his eastern border. In Krakow, the Polish dukes debated whether the threat was real or merely a tale to frighten children. Even the Pope received scattered reports, a pagan scourge rising in the east, though none could say from where it came. For 15 years, this uneasy calm endured, the entire continent holding its breath. But in the Far East, the Mongols were not idle. After Genghis Khan's death, his empire did not crumble, it expanded. Under his successors, the armies regrouped along the Volga. There, Subutai waited, the same old strategist who had crushed the Russes at Kalka. He had learned his lesson well. Next time, the campaign would not be a raid, it would be a conquest. From the steppe lands came reports, first whispers, then confirmations. Hunters spoke of vast herds of horses gathering near the lower Volga. Traders from the east claimed to see entire caravans of carts loaded with grain and arrows. Monks in distant monasteries copied these rumors into their chronicles. The sons of the desert are preparing once more. But when messengers carried these warnings to the courts of Rus, they were met with weary smiles. "Again with your prophecies," said the princes. "Do you think the world turns for every rumor of the steppe?" Still, not everyone dismissed the danger. In Kiev, a few elder nobles urged vigilance. They argued that fortifications were not enough, that only unity could save them. But their voices were drowned by politics. The city councils quarreled over taxes and trade tolls. The princes of the north and south accused each other of ambition and greed. Even the church was divided. Bishops aligning with rival princes, blessing their causes as holy. In this fog of distrust, the warning signs multiplied. Ambassadors from the Volga Bulgars reported that entire Mongol divisions were on the move, building bridges across the river, testing fords, mapping terrain. Along the steppe frontier, smoke signals appeared at night, the scouts of Subutai marking distance, measuring time. A handful of Rus outposts vanished, their garrisons never heard from again. But these losses were dismissed as bandit raids. The princes had grown used to turning their eyes away from inconvenient truths. Inside the Mongol war councils, preparations unfolded with terrifying precision. Subutai divided his forces into 3 great wings. One would sweep across the northern forests, another through the Volga plains, and the third along the Black Sea coast. Each division would move separately, yet converge like talons closing on prey. They built stockpiles of food, trained fresh recruits, forged countless arrowheads. When winter came, they did not rest. They rode in snow to test endurance, to harden their men for the western campaign to come. Every movement was calculated, every silence deliberate. And while the Mongols prepared, the Ruz's princes quarreled over inheritance. In Vladimir, brothers fought for their father's throne. In Smolensk, cousins plotted against cousins. In Galicia, the old prince Mstislav died, leaving a power vacuum that swallowed the entire region in intrigue. What little unity the land had after Kalka dissolved completely. Each court believed it could negotiate or fight on its own terms when the next storm came. In the winter councils of 1236, a few voices still called for a grand alliance. The chronicler of Novgorod wrote of men of wisdom who warned, but none who listened. The warnings fell like snow on frozen ground, pure, silent, and quickly forgotten. By the time the first Mongol scouts reappeared on the horizon, most of Rus was unprepared. Farmers had just stored their harvests. Merchants planned spring fairs. Children played in the streets of Kiev beneath banners depicting saints and angels. The calm before the tempest had lasted too long. It had lulled an entire civilization into sleep. Far away in the Mongol camps along the Volga, Subutai stood beside a map drawn on stretched parchment. His finger traced the rivers. Oka, Don, Dnieper. He turned to the young Khan, Batu, grandson of Genghis, and said in a voice like cold iron, "The roads are open. The princes are divided. The time has come." And so, while Rus still argued about borders and taxes, the greatest invasion in its history began to stir. The hoofbeats that once faded into silence at Kalka would soon return, louder, closer, unstoppable. This time, they would not retreat. Winter had come early that year. Snow covered the plains east of the Oka River, muffling every sound, hiding the breath of death that moved beneath it. Then, one morning, the sentinels of the frontier saw shapes rising from the frost, lines of dark figures stretching to the horizon. They were not travelers, not merchants, not herders. They were horsemen, thousands of them. And behind the riders came endless wagons, siege engines, herds of spare horses, black banners snapping in the cold wind. After 15 years of silence, the Mongols had returned. Their plan was perfection in motion. Subutai's armies advanced like the fingers of a giant hand closing over Rus. From the east, along the Volga, came the main host, tens of thousands of horse archers led by Batu, grandson of Genghis Khan, young but already hardened by conquest. From the south, smaller divisions swept up from the steppes beyond the Don, driving terrified nomads before them. From the northeast, another column moved through frozen forests, cutting off any hope of escape. 3 armies, 3 roads, 1 destiny, to crush the frontier before the snow melted. Their first target was the Principality of Ryazan. It was not the richest or largest of the Rus states, but it stood closest to the frontier, the first wall against invasion. The Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Ingvarovich, received word of the approaching storm too late. The envoys of Batu arrived at his gates demanding tribute equal to the weight of the city. The prince refused. He sent them away with gifts, but no submission. He could not know that this act of pride would doom his people. In early December of 1237, the Mongols surrounded Ryazan. The city, wooden and walled with thick timber, stood above the frozen Oka, its towers glittering with frost. Inside, the people prayed, melted snow for water, and watched the steppe fill with tents. Within days, the siege engines arrived, massive catapults and stone throwers, hauled hundreds of miles on wagons. The Mongols assembled them with silent precision. Then the bombardment began. Day and night, stones the size of millstones crashed against the walls. Arrows rained from the sky. The defenders fought bravely, hurling burning pitch and stones of their own, but the attackers never rested. When one tower fell, another machine took its place. The Mongols worked in shifts, fresh troops replacing the tired, their discipline unbroken. On the 5th day, part of the southern wall collapsed. The attackers swarmed through the breach like a black tide. Inside the city, chaos exploded. The defenders tried to hold the narrow streets, but the Mongols divided their forces, driving wedges between districts, cutting down anyone who resisted. According to the Laurentian Chronicle, the streets ran red for 3 days. The prince's palace was set aflame, and the church bells melted in their towers. Yuri Ingvarovich and his family were slain in the cathedral. His son, captured alive, was dragged before Batu and executed. His body hung before the gates as a warning. There was no mercy. The Mongols massacred the entire city, soldiers, women, children, monks. Those who survived were taken as slaves, their houses burned to the ground. When the fire finally died, Ryazan was a black skeleton against the snow. But the slaughter was not only vengeance, it was psychological warfare. Batu wanted every city of Rus to hear what had happened. He wanted fear to ride ahead of his armies. Messengers were released deliberately, terrified survivors allowed to escape so they could tell others, Ryazan no longer exists. And they did. They ran westward, half mad, their clothes frozen to their skin, spreading the horror faster than any trumpet. In Vladimir, in Suzdal, in Kiev, the stories arrived like winter ghosts. The city burned for 5 days. The rivers froze with blood. The Mongols have machines that throw stones like thunder. Panic spread. Some princes sent envoys begging for peace. Others began calling their levies, though none knew where the enemy would strike next. Prince Yuri of Vladimir tried to send reinforcements to Ryazan, but his messengers never reached it. The relief army, led by his son Vsevolod, marched east and vanished. Somewhere between Kolomna and Ryazan, they met the Mongol vanguard and were annihilated. When scouts returned, they brought only fragments of armor and blood-stained banners. No one could tell how many had fallen. The steppe kept its secrets. As the Mongols advanced westward, they burned everything in their path. Villages that surrendered were stripped of food and left in ashes. Those that resisted were wiped from the map. In every town, they built pyramids of skulls to mark their passage, grim monuments of terror. This was Subutai's method: conquer not only the body, but the soul. Let the next city tremble before the first arrow is loosed. Behind the front lines, Mongol engineers perfected their art. They refined their siege engines, constructing rams and catapults that hurled stones with terrifying range. They built platforms to fire into city interiors, aiming not just for walls, but for morale. They studied each fortress before attacking, mapping weaknesses, finding rivers to cut supply lines. Every city that fell made the next easier. As winter deepened, the refugees multiplied. Caravans of peasants fled north, dragging sleds piled with children and icons. Monks carried relics from burning monasteries. But the roads themselves became death traps, ambushed by Mongol patrols, blocked by snow, or simply frozen rivers impossible to cross. In many villages, those who could not flee burned their homes rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The chronicles say, only the crows remained to witness. When news of Ryazan's fall reached the remaining principalities, the shock was total. Even the bravest princes hesitated. Some considered abandoning their cities altogether. Others clung to faith, sending for relics, summoning priests to bless their walls. A few tried to organize resistance. In Murom, small bands of militia ambushed Mongol scouts in the forests, but they were crushed in days. The princes of Chernigov and Kolomna attempted to raise new armies, yet without coordination, they stood no chance. Each city fought alone, and each fell alone. Strategically, Ryazan's destruction opened the heart of Rus like a wound. The supply routes from the south and east were gone. The Oka River frontier, once the line of defense, was now a highway for the invaders. With Ryazan gone, there was no barrier left between the steppe and the central plains. The Mongols established their forward camps in the ruins of the city, using its ashes as shelter. From there, they launched patrols northward, testing the strength of the next targets. Batu himself rode through the smoldering remains, silent, his fur cloak dusted with snow and soot. Subutai rode beside him, studying the terrain, noting every frozen stream, every stretch of forest that could hide defenders. He knew the next stage would be harder. The farther west they rode, the more forests and rivers would challenge their cavalry. But he also knew that the Russes were broken in spirit. Fear was now his strongest weapon. When the snows began to melt, the Mongols paused, not to rest, but to plan. Messengers rode between divisions, carrying orders sealed in leather. Scouts moved ahead, tracing the road to Vladimir and Suzdal, the richest of the northern principalities, filled with gold-domed churches and merchants' wealth. Those cities would not be easy prey, but Subutai was patient. He would strike them as he had struck Ryazan, methodically, relentlessly, until nothing stood. By spring, the Oka frontier had ceased to exist. Where once stood a proud principality, now lay a graveyard of burnt timber and frozen corpses. The Rus chronicles record that the smoke from Ryazan rose to heaven for 7 days. No army came to avenge it. No prince dared challenge Batu's advance. In the markets of Kiev, merchants whispered that the apocalypse had begun. In Novgorod, far to the north, traders arriving by sleigh spoke of a river of fire sweeping across the land. Some said the end of the world was at hand. Others began to prepare for flight, to the forests, to the western kingdoms, anywhere but the path of the Mongols. Yet even in despair, a few voices urged resistance. The bishops of Vladimir called for courage. Knights repaired their armor, knowing they might soon die in it. Fathers trained sons with old swords. They told themselves that perhaps Ryazan had fallen only because it stood alone, that the next city, united and fortified, could hold. They were wrong, for Batu and Subutai had already chosen their next destination, the shining city of Vladimir, jewel of northern Rus. And they would not stop there. The smoke of Ryazan still darkened the sky when the Mongols turned north. Their horses, hardened by months of frost and fire, now carried them toward the richest lands of Ruses. Before them lay the beating heart of the northern principalities, Vladimir Suzdal, the proud realm that had once rivaled Kiev itself. If Ryazan had been the frontier, Vladimir was the center, the place where all rivers of trade, faith, and power converged. To the princes of Rus, it seemed inconceivable that any army could reach this far. But Subutai had mapped the way long ago. The Mongol columns moved with terrifying precision. From the ashes of Ryazan, Batu led the main host northwest, crossing the frozen Oka River in the dead of night. The ice groaned beneath the weight of men, horses, and siege machines, yet held firm. Flanking divisions swept ahead, seizing bridges, burning watchtowers, silencing any messenger who might run to warn Vladimir. Behind them came the engineers, the same men who had built the catapults that crushed Ryazan's walls. Wherever they marched, the snow was trampled into mud and blood. By late December of 1237, the Mongols reached Kolomna, a fortress town guarding the southern approach to Vladimir. Kolomna was small but fiercely defended. It stood at the confluence of the Moskva and Oka rivers, a natural choke point, the gate to the north. Prince Yuri of Vladimir had sent his son Vsevolod to command there, hoping to stall the invaders until reinforcements could gather. But Batu wasted no time. He encircled the fortress in a ring of steel and fire. The assault began at dawn. Wave after wave of Mongol horsemen surrounded the walls, cutting off all exits. Behind them, a second ring formed, a killing zone designed to trap any who tried to flee. From the hills beyond, the catapults roared to life, hurling stones and flaming pitch. The defenders fought desperately, their arrows bouncing off layered leather and iron. For 2 days, the wooden walls held. Then the Mongols shifted tactics. They set fire to the outer district, driving smoke and heat into the fortress. When the gates finally splintered, the attackers poured through with axes and sabers. Kolomna burned. Vsevolod, the prince's son, was slain in the fighting. His head was taken to Batu's camp and displayed before the men, not as a trophy, but as proof that no lineage, no title, no wall could stop the storm. The fall of Kolomna opened the road to Vladimir. News reached the city too late. Inside its white stone walls, panic spread like wildfire. The Grand Prince Yuri Ingvarovich, now an old man haunted by the ghost of Ryazan, gathered his family and fled north toward the Volga, promising to return with reinforcements. He left behind his young sons and his wife, Grand Princess Agafia, to oversee the defense. The Archbishop of Vladimir ordered every church bell rung, summoning the people to prayer. Monks carried holy icons along the walls, their chants mingling with the sound of hammers as the gates were barred. In February of 1238, the Mongols surrounded Vladimir. The sight was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of riders, tents stretching to the horizon, banners black against the snow. The air trembled with the neighing of horses and the rhythmic pounding of drums. At dawn, the bombardment began. Stones rained upon the walls, smashing towers, crushing roofs. Flaming arrows hissed through the air, setting the city's wooden houses ablaze. Inside, the defenders fought back with what little they had: boiling oil, crossbows, prayers. But the Mongols had studied every weakness. They built ramps against the walls, shielded by wet hides that could not burn. By the third day, a section near the Golden Gate cracked and fell. The Mongols stormed through. Fighting raged from street to street. The cathedral caught fire. Its golden dome collapsed in a shower of sparks. The Grand Princess and her children took refuge inside, kneeling before the altar. When the doors burst open, she threw herself across her sons, but the invaders showed no mercy. By evening, the city that had once been called the Northern Kiev was an inferno. The chronicles would later write, "The city of Vladimir was consumed in flame, and the people were no more." For the first time, the Mongols had pierced the center of Rus. But Batu and Subutai were not finished. They knew the Grand Prince was still alive, retreating north to rally his forces. To secure total victory, they had to hunt him down. In early March, a Mongol vanguard under Subutai's direct command pursued Yuri's scattered army through the forests west of the Volga. The snow was deep, the rivers swollen with ice melt. The Russ's soldiers struggled to move their wagons, sinking into drifts, leaving tracks easy to follow. They tried to regroup near the Sit River, a narrow stream winding through the woods, hoping to wait for reinforcements from Novgorod. But Subutai was already there. At dawn on the 4th of March, 1238, the Mongols fell upon the Rus camp like wolves in fog. Yuri's scouts had barely returned when the arrows began to fall. The Grand Prince, realizing the encirclement, ordered his men to form ranks, but it was too late. The enemy appeared from every direction, a perfect double envelopment, the same tactic that had crushed armies from China to Persia. The Russes fought bravely, their shields locked, their battle cries echoing through the trees. But the Mongols' arrows found every gap. The line broke. Yuri was slain, struck down by a spear as he tried to rally his men. His brother, Prince Sviatoslav, fell beside him. When the battle ended, the snow along the Sit River was red for miles. The Mongols gathered the fallen prince's banners and sent them south to Batu as proof of victory. With their deaths, the organized resistance of northern Rus collapsed. The aftermath was pure terror. News of the disaster raced ahead of the invaders, a weapon of fear even sharper than the sword. Messengers rode from town to town. Vladimir is ash, Kolomna is gone, the Grand Prince is dead. In the halls of the surviving principalities, panic spread. Some nobles fled to forests or foreign lands. Others offered to surrender without a fight, sending gifts of silver and slaves to Batu's camp. It no longer mattered. The Mongols no longer needed to conquer. The people were already defeated in spirit. After Sit River, Subutai divided his forces. Small detachments swept across the countryside, torching villages, capturing stockpiles of grain, and hunting survivors. They seized Gorokovets, Suzdal, Rostov, and countless lesser towns, each falling within days. The pattern was always the same: surrender and live as slaves, or resist and vanish. By the time spring returned, the central plains of Rus were silent. Wherever the Mongols rode, they left behind new outposts, forward camps, fortified with earthworks and towers. These became their supply bases for the next stage of the campaign, stretching like iron thorns across the land. They stored fodder, grain, and arrows, building the logistical web that would sustain the march westward. In the cities that remained untouched, the people waited in dread. In Rostov, priests carried icons through the streets, begging heaven for mercy. In Yaroslavl, mothers hid their children in cellars at the sound of distant drums. In every church, candles burned day and night, not in hope of salvation, but in fear of extinction. By summer, the Mongols had achieved the impossible. In less than 6 months, they had annihilated the entire eastern and central defense line of Rus. No prince remained with an army large enough to stand against them. The great northern forests lay open, the Volga under their control, and the once proud cities reduced to embers. For Subutai, it was a masterpiece, a campaign executed with mathematical precision. For the people of Rus, it was the end of the world. The chronicles simply said, "God turned his face from us." And yet, the Mongols did not stop. Even as their horses rested and the rivers thawed, scouts rode farther west, toward the Dnieper, toward the lands of Chernigov and Kiev. The path to the south lay open now. The death of Vladimir had broken the northern spine of Rus. The next blows would fall upon the south, upon the ancient cradle of their faith, upon the heart of all Rus. By the spring of 1239, the northern forests of Rus lay in ashes. Batu and Subutai now turned their gaze southward, toward the warmer plains, toward the ancient heartlands along the Dnieper River. There, among the rolling steppe and fertile valleys, stood the great southern principalities, Chernigov, Pereyaslav, and the distant realm of Galich, capital of Galicia Volhynia, the last bastion before Poland and Hungary. The new campaign began like the slow drawing of a bow. Scouts rode ahead from the Volga steppe, measuring roads, rivers, and supply lines. The Mongol host divided once more. The main army advanced from the east and southeast, following the frozen river valleys. Smaller columns swept down from the north, converging on the old trade towns that linked the upper and lower Dnieper. Their plan was simple: surround, isolate, annihilate. The first blow fell upon Chernigov, one of the oldest and proudest cities of Russes. Its princes traced their lineage to the age of Kiev's golden saints. Its walls were thick, its armories full, its churches crowned with silver domes. But Chernigov's pride would be its undoing. When Batu's vanguard appeared on the horizon, the city refused to surrender. The princes believed their walls and their faith would hold. The Mongols encircled the city in a single day, cutting every road, every stream. Siege engines were rolled into place. Trenches were dug around the perimeter to trap any who might flee. From beyond arrow range, Subutai ordered his artillery forward, massive mangonels hurling stones that smashed through the towers. The bombardment continued for days. When the walls cracked, the Mongols switched tactics. They built a second ring of cavalry behind their own infantry, trapping the defenders in a deadly circle. No escape forward, no retreat backward. By the seventh day, the gates were splintered. The attackers poured in. The fall of Chernigov was swift and merciless. Fires consumed the market district. The cathedral collapsed beneath the weight of its burning roof. Chronicles would later say the Mongols left not even the newborn alive. Whether from horror or exhaustion, the survivors scattered west, peasants, monks, nobles, carrying with them the same message that had once echoed from Ryazan: the horsemen have come. To the south, Pereyaslav was next. Perched along the upper Dnieper, it had once been a bustling center of trade with the steppe nomads, a city accustomed to raiders, but never to this. When Batu's forces arrived, the people had no time to prepare. The walls fell within 2 days. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Men were cut down in the streets, women and children dragged away in chains. The Mongols looted the churches, melted sacred icons for silver, and burned the city to the ground. Witnesses said that even the river seemed to carry the cries of the dying. The destruction of Pereyaslav shattered the southern defense network. Every fortress between the Don and the Dnieper had either fallen or fled. For centuries, these cities had been bound by alliances, a web of trade and protection stretching across the plains. Now, that web was torn apart. Each principality stood alone, its walls nothing more than fragile islands in a sea of fear. Modern historians would later call it the Mongols' network war, the deliberate dismantling of communication and mutual aid. Batu and Subutai understood that to conquer a land, one must first break its connections. They destroyed bridges, cut courier routes, slaughtered messengers, and spared no refugee who might carry warnings. Isolation became their weapon. And their cruelty, as terrifying as it was, served a purpose. By forcing entire populations into the open, peasants, artisans, soldiers, priests, they created chaos before striking. This forced evacuation tactic, described by modern scholars, was both logistical and psychological. Flush the people out, scatter them into panic, then destroy them in groups. In the lands of Galicia-Volhynia, the same method would repeat. The herding of civilians before extermination, a grim dance of terror that scholars still cite today in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies. The Mongols also practiced a colder, more calculated policy. They selected the strongest young men among the captured, thousands of them, and conscripted them as kashar, auxiliary troops. These unwilling recruits became the carriers of their own nation's doom, used to build siege engines, dig trenches, or march in the front lines as expendable shields. In one tragic account, a monk from Volhynia wrote, "Our sons returned as strangers, speaking the tongue of our enemies." By late autumn, the Mongol horde pressed deeper into the Ukrainian plains. Their next target was Gelich, the glittering capital of the southwestern principalities. Nestled among forests and rivers, Gelich had long been the jewel of the region, a crossroads of Eastern and Western Europe, with trade routes reaching to Krakow and Budapest. If Gelich fell, the road into Poland and Hungary would open. Prince Danilo Romanovich, ruler of Galicia-Volhynia, was no ordinary lord. Young, shrewd, and bold, he understood that open battle against the Mongols was suicide. Instead, he fortified his cities, withdrew his people into the forests, and launched guerrilla raids on enemy supply lines. His archers struck at night, burned wagons, vanished into the snow. For a time, it worked. The Mongols found themselves harassed by ghosts. But Subutai was patient. He sent small detachments to feint toward Hungary and Poland, drawing Danilo's attention westward. Then, from the east, the main force advanced, slowly, methodically, burning villages as they came. Galich was soon surrounded. The siege lasted weeks. Inside, food ran low. Refugees crowded the streets. Disease spread. The defenders fought from tower to tower, their arrows dwindling. Every day, they could see the enemy building new machines beyond the walls. Taller, stronger, more terrible than before. When the first breach opened, the fighting turned house to house, yard to yard. Danilo ordered his people to withdraw west toward the Carpathians, refusing to surrender. He would live to fight another day, but Galich itself was doomed. When the city fell, the devastation was total. The Mongols looted the treasury, burned the royal palace, and slaughtered the population. The few who escaped described fields littered with corpses, rivers black with ash, and skies choked with smoke. One chronicler wrote simply, "The light of Gallic went out. Across the winter returned, white and merciless." Across the snow-covered plains of Ukraine, the ground trembled once more with the thunder of hooves. The Mongols had come at last for Kiev, the mother of all Russ's cities, the ancient cradle of Slavic faith and pride. By the end of November, 1240, the vanguard of Batu Khan appeared on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. Behind them stretched a line of tents, engines, and banners that seemed to reach the horizon. For a week, they gathered like a storm cloud forming above the river. Then, in the final days of November, they crossed the ice and advanced on the city. According to the chronicles, the siege began on the 28th of November. By the 6th of December, Kiev would no longer exist. The Mongols moved methodically. Their camp sprawled around the city like a tightening noose, one division on the east, another on the south, the third on the west, leaving only the frozen river to the north as a silent witness. Subutai, ever the strategist, chose his ground carefully. He placed his siege machines beneath the cover of wooded hills where the city's defenders could not easily strike them with counterfire. Batu Khan, commanding from a black tent on a rise above the Dnieper, gave only one order: leave none alive who defies us. Inside the walls, the defenders prepared for the impossible. Kiev's garrison was small, a few thousand men at best. Its governor, the brave voivode Dmitro, was a soldier of the Galician prince Danilo Romanovich, sent to hold the city in his lord's absence. He had under his command a handful of knights, some local militia, and the desperate courage of the townspeople. Old men sharpened axes. Monks carried icons along the battlements. Even women and children filled buckets, forming human chains to douse fires when the bombardment began. The defenders knew what was coming. They had heard the stories. Ryazan burned, Vladimir destroyed, Galich buried in ashes. But Kiev was not just another city. It was the symbol of Russes, the city of St. Sophia, where the first princes had been crowned and baptized. To lose Kiev was to lose the soul of the nation. The first Mongol demand came swiftly. Batu sent envoys to the gate, offering mercy in exchange for surrender and tribute. But Kiev's pride was as strong as its walls. The chroniclers say that the envoys were killed, a fatal act of defiance. Perhaps it was rage, perhaps desperation, perhaps the memory of every city that had surrendered and died anyway. Whatever the reason, the message to Batu was clear. Kiev would not yield. The Great Khan's grandson gave no second warning. The siege engines rolled forward. Enormous catapults, constructed from oak and iron, hurled boulders that shattered towers like eggshells. Flaming arrows rained upon rooftops, setting the merchant quarter ablaze. The constant thunder of impact echoed through the night, a rhythm of doom. Behind the walls, people prayed as the earth shook. The Mongols chose their approach carefully. The southern wall was heavily reinforced, but the western gate, shielded by a line of trees and narrow hills, was more vulnerable. From there, under cover of darkness, Subutai ordered engineers to dig trenches, rolling siege towers forward plank by plank. Each morning, the defenders awoke to find the machines closer. Each night, the sky glowed red from the burning suburbs outside the walls. For a week, Kiev endured. Then, on the 6th day of December, the western gate collapsed. The Mongols surged in. The streets of Kiev became a nightmare. The defenders fought block by block, wielding spears, axes, even kitchen knives. Citizens formed barricades of overturned carts and burning timbers. For a moment, it seemed the tide might hold. But then came the inner assault, a second wave of Mongols from the southern breach, cutting off retreat. The city fell into chaos. House by house, the conquerors advanced. Fire leapt from roof to roof. The air grew thick with ash and screams. Monks died defending the cathedral. Soldiers dragged the wounded into crypts, sealing doors with stone in vain hope of survival. In the square before St. Sophia, Voivode Dmitro fought until his sword broke, rallying the last of his men before he was surrounded and slain. No mercy followed. The Mongols moved through the city like a tide of iron and flame, killing everyone they found. Men were cut down in the streets. Women and children were taken captive, chained together for transport east. Those too old or weak to walk were left behind in the burning ruins. By nightfall, the city of 100 churches was a single sea of fire. The next morning, Batu Khan rode through the smoke. He ordered the surviving captives, craftsmen, smiths, builders, separated from the rest. They would be spared, forced to serve the conquerors. The rest were led away or slain where they stood. The Mongols did not sack Kiev for greed. They destroyed it as a message to all of Europe. This is what happens to those who resist the sons of Genghis. The chronicles tell of utter devastation. Churches burned until their domes collapsed. The markets melted into slag. Bones littered the streets. When the fires finally died, only a few hundred souls remained among the tens of thousands who had once lived there. 6 years later, in 1246, the Franciscan envoy Giovanni da Pian del Carpine passed through the ruins of Kiev on his way to the Mongol capital. He wrote in horror, "We found the city almost empty. The bones of the dead were scattered across the fields. The walls were broken, and the few who lived there trembled as slaves." His words echoed across Europe, a grim reminder of what the East had become under Mongol rule. In the aftermath, Kiev ceased to be a capital. The heart of Rus was torn out. The grand cathedrals that had once shone with mosaics were blackened husks. The trade routes that had once pulsed with life fell silent. The Dnieper, once the river of commerce and pilgrimage, now carried only ashes downstream. For centuries, Kiev had been the beacon of Slavic unity, the city where princes were crowned, where the faith of Rus was born. Now it was a grave. The few survivors drifted away, some to the forests, others to distant towns like Galicia or Novgorod. In the silence that followed, even the bells of St. Sophia were gone. From the Mongol camp, Batu looked down upon the smoking ruins. He said nothing. Subutai stood beside him, silent as well. Their victory was complete, not just of arms, but of terror. They had crushed the spirit of Rus. And in the months that followed, they would formalize what had already begun, the long shadow of Mongol rule, stretching across the next 2 centuries. For the people of Rus, the winter of 1240 was the darkest in memory. Fathers buried sons beneath the snow. Mothers searched for children taken into bondage. Priests stood before blackened altars, whispering prayers to a heaven that seemed empty. Every fire that burned in Kiev's ruins was like a candle for the dead, and there were too many to count. When spring returned, the grass grew over the ashes, and wildflowers bloomed among the bones. Travelers on the road to Galicia passed the ruins in silence, crossing themselves as they rode. They said that the wind still carried the sound of bells, the ghostly echo of the cathedral that once ruled all Russes. Kiev had fallen. The crown of the old kingdom lay shattered in the dust. From its fragments would rise new powers, Moscow in the forests to the north, Galicia Volhynia in the west. But the age of Kiev was gone. Under the gray sky, the Mongol banners fluttered above the Dnieper. The city that had once been called the mother of Russes was now a daughter of the horde. And for the first time in its long history, the cradle of Eastern Europe lay silent. The fires of Kiev still smoldered when the Mongols turned their faces east again. Their mission was complete. The cities of Russes lay broken, the princes dead or scattered, the land silent under snow. But the conquest was only the beginning. What came next would not be a campaign of swords, but of rule, colder, quieter, and longer lasting. From the embers of conquest rose a new power, the Golden Horde. It began as a collection of camps along the lower Volga River. Still, tens of thousands of tents, wagons, and herds clustered like a moving city. Here, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, built his capital. He named it Sarai, the palace, and from its endless plains of dust and silk would emerge a government unlike anything Russes had ever known. At first, the Russes people thought the invaders would leave, as raiders had before. They were wrong. The Mongols had come not merely to burn, but to govern. The surviving princes received messages written on yellow parchment, stamped with seals of iron. Those who serve will live. Those who resist will die. Slowly, the princes returned to their ruined towns, not as rulers, but as vassals. They brought tribute, furs, silver, grain, slaves. Each year, Mongol envoys arrived to collect the dues. Those who paid were left in peace. Those who hesitated saw their villages razed again. The land of Russes became a tributary realm, a chattel of the Golden Horde, bound by oath and coin. To enforce this new order, Batu appointed governors known as Baskaks, Mongol officials who oversaw taxation and loyalty. Each province had its watcher, a Noyan, a commander, or a trusted agent of the Khan. They lived in fortified compounds, surrounded by interpreters and guards, speaking through translators to trembling local lords. Their presence was constant, the embodiment of the Horde's will. Every household was registered, every field measured, every horse counted. The census was the Horde's greatest weapon, a net thrown over an entire nation. For the first time, the Russes were ruled not by swords, but by numbers. And with numbers came taxes. The annual tribute, called the Vihad, drained the wealth of every principality. Peasants gave grain and livestock, merchants paid in silver, nobles surrendered their sons as hostages. Even the church, once untouchable, was forced to offer prayers for the Khan's soul in exchange for survival. The princes, stripped of their autonomy, became collectors for their own oppressors, taxmen for the Horde. Yet the Mongols were not chaos, they were order. Their rule was brutal but efficient. They built post stations, relay points where fresh horses and messengers carried news across thousands of miles. They revived the trade routes that war had destroyed, connecting the forests of the north to the deserts of Central Asia. Caravans once again crossed the steppe, carrying silk, spices, and the strange inventions of the East, paper money, gunpowder, compasses. Through the smoke of conquest, a faint thread of commerce and communication began to hum again. It was a paradox the people could scarcely comprehend. The Horde destroyed the world, then taught its survivors how to rebuild it. For most of Rus, life became a grim routine of obedience. Once a year, a Mongol delegation would arrive at the gates of each city. Trumpets sounded, priests came out with crosses, and the princes knelt in the snow to present tribute. The Baskak would accept it, nodding coldly, then return to his camp. Behind him, the people sighed with relief. One more year of survival purchased in gold and tears. But not every corner of Rus was crushed equally. The far northern lands, deep in the forests, lay beyond the Horde's easy reach. There, in the small but ambitious city of Moscow, something unexpected began to stir. Moscow had been a mere trading post before the invasion, a cluster of wooden houses along the Moskva River. Now isolated yet spared the worst of the destruction, it began to grow. Its princes, shrewder than most, sought favor rather than defiance. They paid their tributes on time. They offered soldiers when asked. They spoke humbly in Sarai and returned with the Khan's blessing. In return, they gained what mattered most: recognition. Under Mongol eyes, Moscow rose quietly, not through rebellion, but through loyalty. Its princes became intermediaries between Rus and the Horde, collecting taxes from their neighbors and delivering them east. Each coin that passed through their hands added to their own wealth and influence. The Mongols, indifferent to internal politics, saw no harm in letting one city manage the others, so long as the tribute flowed without delay. And thus, by accident or design, Moscow began to replace Kiev as the heart of Russes. For the common people, however, life was misery. Heavy taxation and forced labor reduced villages to poverty. Those who could not pay were sold into slavery. Families were torn apart as young men were drafted into auxiliary Mongol armies sent to fight in Persia, China, or the Middle East. Others were pressed into service as guides, blacksmiths, or carpenters, building the very machines that had once destroyed their cities. But the Mongols were not mindless tyrants. Their rule was pragmatic, harsh to the disobedient, tolerant to the loyal. Cities that resisted were erased. Cities that submitted were left in peace. Trade flourished along the new steppe road. Merchants traveled safely under Mongol protection, bearing the silver seal of the Khan that guaranteed their lives. Even the princes began to see opportunity within servitude. Those who proved useful were rewarded with titles, lands, and permission to rebuild their fortresses. Over time, the scars of war began to blur. Wooden churches rose where stone cathedrals once stood. Markets reopened. Children born after the invasion knew only the rule of the Horde. To them, the Mongol envoys were not conquerors but a fact of life, as unchangeable as winter itself. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. In whispers and prayers, the people cursed their overlords. Monks wrote secret chronicles, calling the Mongols the scourge of God. Peasant uprisings flickered in remote valleys, crushed before they could spread. A few daring princes plotted alliances with Lithuania or Hungary, dreaming of liberation. But the Horde's spies were everywhere, and every rumor reached Sarai. Those who defied the Khan vanished, their names erased, their families enslaved. Still, resistance found subtler forms. In the cathedrals, icons of new saints appeared, martyrs of the Mongol years, symbols of silent endurance. The church became the keeper of hope, teaching that the yoke was a test of faith, that someday the Lord would break it. And in secret, the chronicles began to name a new destiny, that from the forests of the north would rise a prince strong enough to defy the Horde. Meanwhile, the geography of power shifted irreversibly. The great river cities, Kiev, Chernigov, Pereyaslav, were shadows of their former selves. Their streets lay empty, their walls crumbling. The pulse of Russes had moved northeast, toward the forests and the frost, toward Moscow, Tver, and Suzdal. The age of the southern plains was over. The future belonged to the north. By the middle of the 13th century, the Tatar yoke, as later generations would call it, had become the defining fact of Rus life. Tribute, fear, and obedience shaped every prayer, every harvest, every dream. Yet even under oppression, the Rus's spirit endured, learning, adapting, waiting. They absorbed the Mongol systems of governance, borrowed their methods of taxation, their discipline, even their military organization. In time, these lessons, born of servitude, beset would become weapons of independence. For now, though, the darkness deepened. The Golden Horde reigned supreme, stretching from the Volga to the Carpathians, from the Caspian to the Baltic. Its riders patrolled the steppe like ghosts. Its envoys carried the Khan's word to every corner of the known world. And in the silent forests of Rus, the people bowed their heads and prayed that the storm might someday pass. But storms, once born, rarely fade. They only move. The dust of conquest had settled, but peace did not follow. It was not the peace of order. It was the silence of a people living beneath the weight of empire. The Golden Horde ruled with an invisible hand. Few battles, little bloodshed, yet fear hung in every breath. The princes of Rus had survived the storm, but now faced a crueler dilemma: how to live under it. In the courts of their ruined cities, debates raged like quiet fires. Should they resist and risk extinction, or submit and lose their souls? Every decision came with a price. Every path led toward betrayal. Some chose to collaborate, seeing in the Horde not only power but opportunity. Others whispered of rebellion, meeting in candlelit chapels or frozen forests, plotting impossible uprisings. And between them stood the people, farmers, craftsmen, monks, crushed between loyalty and survival, praying for deliverance that never came. It was a time of bitter choices. The Mongols demanded tribute, obedience, and silence. They cared little who ruled the principalities, so long as the taxes flowed and no banners of defiance were raised. This gave the princes room to maneuver, but also enough rope to hang themselves. To defy openly was suicide. To comply too eagerly was disgrace. And so began an era of half-truths, hidden allegiances, and masks worn by every man of rank. The grand halls of Russes became stages for double games. Princes swore loyalty to Batu Khan with trembling voices, then sent secret messengers to Lithuania or Poland asking for help. Others pretended to plan rebellion, only to betray their fellow conspirators to the Baskaks for favor and gold. In Sarai, the Mongol court grew expert at reading these divided hearts. Their envoys, fluent in deceit and diplomacy alike, played the princes against each other, ensuring no alliance could ever hold. It was rule by manipulation, and it worked. Some principalities, desperate to ease their suffering, sent envoys of their own. Caravans laden with furs and silver crossed the steppe toward Sarai, carrying letters of submission and pleas for mercy. A few princes even sent their sons and daughters as hostages, offering them to the Khan's court as tokens of faith. There, among foreign tongues and alien customs, these young nobles grew up speaking Mongol and Turkic, serving as interpreters, scribes, or soldiers. Many never returned. Those who did brought back strange habits, strange words, and eyes that seemed older than their years. In exchange for obedience, the Horde sometimes granted small concessions. Taxes were lightened for loyal cities. Traders received seals of protection, allowing them to cross the steppe unmolested. Even bishops who prayed for the Khan's health found themselves spared from persecution. It was the illusion of mercy, enough to keep hope alive, but never enough to end the suffering. Meanwhile, in the shadows, resistance simmered. Scattered bands of warriors, remnants of the old Russ's armies, gathered in the forests and marshlands, striking at Mongol patrols and tax convoys. They were few and poorly armed, yet their attacks carried symbolic weight. In Chernigov and Rostov, entire villages refused to pay tribute, driving out the Mongol collectors and sealing their gates. For a brief moment, rebellion flickered, only to be crushed with unrelenting precision. Those towns were burned, their inhabitants sold or slain. The message was clear: defiance would be remembered, but not rewarded. Some princes adopted a subtler approach. They practiced what later chroniclers called conditional lenience, a policy of calculated submission. They bowed when required, paid when demanded, and plotted quietly when no one was watching. By appearing obedient, they gained the freedom to rebuild their fortresses, train small militias, and re-establish trade. They learned to use the Mongols' bureaucracy against itself, exploiting the gaps between governors and generals. When one Baskok fell from favor, a bribe could install another more pliable. It was governance by survival. Politics turned into camouflage. Over time, the cracks in the Mongol system began to show. Greed, corruption, and arrogance crept into the administration. The Baskaks, many of them far from home and drunk on local power, began to exploit the people beyond the Khan's decrees. They extorted bribes, seized wives, and demanded gifts for imaginary offenses. Complaints rose from the cities and churches, carried on parchment and prayer. Some reached Sarai, where Batu's successors frowned but did little. To the Rus, it seemed that the empire that had once ruled with perfect discipline was now decaying from within. And where there is weakness, there is hope. Stories began to spread among the people, whispers of coming deliverance. Bards and monks composed tales of saints and heroes who would rise to free the land. In the monasteries of Novgorod, scribes wrote of a northern prince destined to break the Tatar yoke. Children learned his name before he was even born. These were not rebellions, but seeds of faith planted in the soil of despair. At the same time, the old unity of Rus continued to fracture. The princes divided themselves into factions, the loyalists and the defiant. The loyalists argued that submission preserved life and allowed the church to survive. The defiant called them traitors, accusing them of selling Rus's dignity for Mongol gold. In many courts, these arguments turned bloody. Assassinations became common. Brothers poisoned brothers. Cousins fought duels over accusations of collaboration. While the horde ruled from afar, Rusiswa devoured itself from within. Moscow, once again, played its game with quiet cunning. Its princes maintained open loyalty to the horde while secretly aiding rebellions that weakened rival cities. When a neighboring principality fell out of favor with the Mongols, Moscow stepped in as the reliable servant, collecting their taxes and absorbing their lands. Through patience and duplicity, Moscow expanded, not by the sword, but by survival. The Mongols, seeing their tribute arrive on time, smiled upon the city, unaware they were nurturing their future rival. And yet, beneath the political games, genuine courage endured. In the forests and mountain passes, small groups of rebels learned to fight in shadows, striking Mongol convoys, stealing weapons, spreading false reports to confuse the enemy. Some infiltrated the horde's bureaucracy, feeding false information or assassinating corrupt officials. These acts, though small, carried immense psychological power. They reminded the people that the conquerors were not gods. They could bleed, they could die, they could be deceived. The Mongols, accustomed to open war, found themselves fighting an enemy that hid among the very peasants they taxed. Subutai was gone, Batu was aging. The iron discipline of the first generation began to wane. In the distant steppes, rival khans quarreled over succession, and the horde's attention drifted. It was during these lapses that Russes learned to breathe again, shallowly, cautiously, but freely. Still, rebellion never came without blood. Each small uprising was followed by ruthless reprisal. Entire towns were destroyed to set examples. The chronicles tell of rivers running red again, of villages erased from maps, of screams echoing across frozen plains. But now, unlike the early days, these acts of violence no longer broke the people's spirit. They hardened it. Every punishment created another martyr, another legend, another reason to endure. Through it all, faith and folklore became the twin pillars of resistance. Songs spoke of the time before the Mongols, of princes who fought with honor and saints who defended the innocent. Pilgrims carried secret icons carved with hidden symbols: a sword, a rising sun, a bird in flight. The church, though forced to bless the Khan's rule publicly, whispered different sermons behind closed doors. God tests us, but his mercy will return. By the close of the century, the people of Rus had learned a new kind of warfare, not of swords and fire, but of patience, deceit, and endurance. They had learned to bend without breaking, to bow without surrendering, to wait until the oppressor's gaze turned elsewhere. And that gaze would turn, for empires, like storms, always move on. The Mongols still ruled, their taxmen still rode, their banners still flew. But beneath that vast shadow, something was stirring, the slow heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. In the far west of Rus, beyond the smoking plains and the reach of Sarai's taxmen, a different fire burned, not of destruction, but of defiance. Here, between the Carpathian Mountains and the rivers of Volhynia, lay the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia, the last stronghold of an independent Russes. It was a land of forests, hills, and stubborn hearts, a frontier between east and west, between submission and freedom. And at its center stood a man who refused to kneel, Prince Daniel of Galicia. Daniel Romanovich, known later as Danilo Halitsky, had seen the Mongol storm with his own eyes. He had watched the cities burn, the princes die, the old world crumble. But where others bowed to survive, Daniel learned to bend without breaking. His rule, from the mid-13th century onward, became the symbol of a living resistance, quiet, intelligent, and fiercely proud. The geography of Galicia-Volhynia gave him a gift no other prince had: terrain that fought for him. Rolling hills, deep forests, and marshes formed natural barriers that cavalry dreaded. The Mongol hordes, so deadly on open steppe, found themselves slowed, funneled, and blinded. Daniel used that to his advantage. He transformed his land into a fortress, not of walls alone, but of mobility and cunning. His soldiers knew the terrain like the lines of their palms. When Mongol detachments approached, the locals vanished into the woods, leaving behind empty villages and poisoned wells. At night, small Ruz's units struck from the shadows, burned supply wagons, and disappeared before dawn. When the enemy advanced, they found nothing but silence and smoke. It was not victory, not yet, but it was survival. Unlike other princes who had chosen reckless defiance, Daniel understood that resistance required time. So he made a bargain. He sent envoys to the Golden Horde, bearing gifts and words of submission, promises of tribute, of loyalty, of peace. It was a temporary truce, a mask worn until his people could rebuild. The Mongols, pragmatic as always, accepted. They needed obedient governors in the west more than they needed another pile of ashes. And so, for a while, Galicia-Volhynia lived. A vassal in name, but a kingdom in spirit. Under this fragile peace, Daniel turned his energy to rebuilding. He restored the fortresses that war had shattered, rebuilt bridges, and reopened trade routes. Merchants once again carried salt and amber from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Caravans from Hungary and Poland passed through his markets, paying tolls that filled his coffers. The prince imposed taxes, not as tribute to the horde, but as investment in endurance. Grain stockpiled in fortified towns, roads repaired to move troops swiftly. The city of Volodymyr Volynskyi became his base, a center of administration, learning, and quiet preparation. From there, Daniel strengthened his hold on the western frontier, fortifying castles with stone instead of wood. He ordered the construction of Lviv, a new city built to symbolize renewal, its name taken from his son Lev, the lion. The message was clear. Russes still lived, and her heart now beat in the west. At the same time, Daniel began to weave a network of diplomacy that stretched beyond the shadow of the horde. He sought allies in Hungary, Poland, and even the papacy. If the Mongols were the storm from the east, perhaps salvation could come from the west. He sent envoys to King Bela of Hungary and Duke Bolesław of Poland, proposing a joint front, a shield of Christian kingdoms to halt Mongol expansion. Though these alliances were fragile and fleeting, they gave hope to a land that had known none. For the first time in decades, a Rus prince was talking of unity, not survival. Daniel's armies, trained and rebuilt, became models of adaptation. He combined Rus's infantry with Cuman light cavalry, the very horsemen who had once fled before Subutai. He taught his men to fight like the enemy, fast, mobile, unpredictable. When Mongol patrols entered his lands, they found ambushes instead of battles, traps instead of armies. He understood that he could not meet the horde head-on. Instead, he would bleed them slowly. And so, Galicia-Volhynia endured while the rest of Russes bowed. To the east, cities still smoldered. To the north, Moscow gathered strength in silence. But in the west, Daniel's realm stood as a flickering torch against the endless dark. The Mongols tolerated his rule for a time. They demanded tribute, and he paid. But within his lands, he ruled as a king in all but name. He minted coins, held court, and enforced his own laws. The horde's envoys visited rarely, for even they respected his resolve. To them, Daniel was a useful anomaly, a loyal prince who governed efficiently and kept the border calm. To his people, he was something else entirely, the last free ruler of Russes. With peace came prosperity. Trade caravans returned, markets filled with goods from Venice and Byzantium. Churches were rebuilt in white stone, monks copied books again. The road that once connected Kiev to Krakow revived as the Eastern Way, a golden thread of exchange between civilizations. Galicia became a bridge between worlds, a Russes reborn through commerce and cunning. But Daniel's ambitions did not end with survival. He dreamed of striking back. In secret councils, he spoke of driving the Mongols from the Dnieper, of restoring the banner of Russes over Kiev. He gathered intelligence. Spies sent eastward into the horde's camps, disguised as traders or translators. From them came whispers of troop movements, fortifications, and rivalries among Mongol commanders. He learned to read their strengths and weaknesses, and to exploit their divisions. By the late 1240s, small victories began to appear. Galician scouts ambushed a Mongol tax caravan near the Dniester. Local militias recaptured a burned fortress. Even minor triumphs carried enormous weight, every rumor of success spreading from village to village like fire in dry grass. People began to speak again of deliverance, of the old days, of Rus rising from its knees. Daniel encouraged this spirit. He built new churches, sponsored festivals, and patronized poets who sang of resilience and pride. He knew that culture was the first weapon of resistance. When the people remembered who they were, they would no longer fear. And when fear was gone, freedom could begin. In 1254, Pope Innocent IV sent envoys to Daniel, offering him a crown, recognition from the West as King of Russes. Daniel accepted it not for glory, but for diplomacy. The title gave him legitimacy among Europe's rulers and leverage with the horde. Yet he never forgot who had truly given him his power. Not Rome, not Sarai, but his people. He wore the crown lightly, as a symbol of defiance, a reminder that Russes still breathed. Even so, the balance was fragile. The Mongols watched closely, wary of rebellion. When Daniel tested their patience, refusing new taxes or strengthening his army, the horde retaliated with raids, swift and punishing. Each time he rebuilt. Each time he survived. His realm became a living lesson, how to fight an empire without declaring war. By the late 13th century, the embers of his resistance had spread. Across the forests and rivers of the north, whispers of revolt began again. Moscow, Tver, and Suzdal, once submissive, looked west and saw hope. If Daniel could defy the horde and live, perhaps they could too. The seeds he planted, diplomacy, cunning, resilience, would one day grow into the roots of liberation. For now, though, the dream remained fragile. Galicia-Volhynia stood proud but isolated, its allies unreliable, its enemies endless. Yet within its walls, something profound had changed. The people no longer called themselves victims of the Mongols. They called themselves survivors, heirs to a destiny the horde could not erase. The Mongol banners still flew across the steppe. The Baskaks still counted tribute. But in the west, in a land of stone castles and steadfast hearts, the spirit of Russes had rekindled. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with armies, but with endurance. And from that whisper would one day come the thunder of rebellion. The fires of conquest faded long ago, but their smoke still lingers in the memory of nations. From the ruins of Kiev rose not silence, but transformation. Slow, painful, and enduring. The Mongol storm had shattered the world of Rus, yet from that destruction emerged a new map, a new identity, and new powers destined to shape the centuries to come. When Kiev fell in 1240, it was not merely a city that died. It was the end of an era, the twilight of the old Kievan Rus, the cradle of Eastern Slavic civilization. But history, like the Dnieper itself, does not end where it breaks. It flows onward, carving new channels through the debris of the past. From those ashes, the center of power began to move. South and west, the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia carried the flame of independence, standing as the western guardian of the Rus' spirit. To the northeast, in the forests of the Oka and the Moskva rivers, another seed was growing. Small, patient, and enduring. Moscow, once an obscure wooden town, began to gather power under the shadow of the Golden Horde. The shift was subtle at first. The princes of Moscow were neither heroes nor rebels. They were survivors. By mastering the art of obedience, they learned to wield the Mongols' own tools: taxation, administration, discipline. The Horde had taught them how to rule, and one day they would use that knowledge to overthrow it. Thus, from the ashes of servitude, a new empire began to form, one that would inherit not the grandeur of Kiev, but its resilience. This migration of power from Kiev's riverbanks to Moscow's forests changed the destiny of Eastern Europe. It forged two souls within one heritage: the Western Rus, shaped by Galicia and Europe, and the Eastern Rus, hardened by Mongol order and steppe discipline. In this duality lay both the richness and the tragedy of Slavic history. A civilization reborn, divided between sword and scripture, east and west, freedom and control. Yet the influence of the Golden Horde did not vanish with its decline. For 2 centuries, its legacy seeped into every vein of Rus's life. Its tribute systems became the foundation of later taxation. Its military organization, the decimal hierarchy, the census, the postal relay, became models for governance long after the Mongols had gone. Even the grand princes who would one day call themselves czars borrowed the symbols of steppe kingship: the iron seal, the throne beneath the tent, the absolute authority of the Khan. What had begun as enslavement became in time a strange inheritance. Through domination, Rus's learned discipline. Through humiliation, it learned endurance. Through loss, it learned the necessity of unity. And unity, that elusive, fragile ideal, was the greatest lesson of all. Had the princes of Rus stood together in the 12th century, perhaps the Mongols would have met a wall of steel instead of a scattering of quarrels. But their rivalries, Galicia against Kiev, Chernigov against Vladimir, made them easy prey. Each fought for his own throne while the horizon darkened. The Mongols did not conquer Rus. Rus offered itself in pieces. The chronicles written later by monks in Novgorod carried this truth like a wound. Division is the weapon of our enemies and our shame. It became the moral scar of a nation, a warning for generations. Even amid ruin, life persisted. Slowly, painstakingly, the fields were sown again. Villages rose where battlefields had been. Merchants crept back onto the trade roads, carrying wax, furs, and salt. Peasants rebuilt wooden churches from the stones of shattered cathedrals. The economy of Rus did not bloom. It endured, like grass pushing through ash. The rebuilding was not merely physical. It was cultural, spiritual, human. The people of Rus began to write again: chronicles, prayers, songs. They recorded not only their losses, but their lessons. Out of grief grew wisdom. Out of despair, identity. Every generation added its stories of heroism, martyrdom, betrayal. The Chronicle of Novgorod, the Galician-Volhynian Chronicle, the songs of wandering bards, all became repositories of memory. In their verses, fallen princes became saints, lost cities became symbols, and the Mongol invasion became not just a tragedy, but a crucible. The people who emerged from it were no longer the same as those who had fallen. They were tempered. Over time, the church became the guardian of this spirit. It preserved the idea of Rus as a sacred whole, even when its lands were divided. Icons of saints slain by invaders hung beside depictions of the Virgin shielding the faithful. In monasteries, monks prayed for the souls of the lost princes, not as sinners, but as warnings. The faith that had once flourished in Kiev now took root in Vladimir, Rostov, and Moscow, carrying with it the memory of the old mother city like a relic of the heart. Meanwhile, in the far west, Galicia-Volhynia retained its distinct voice. Its culture blended the Slavic with the European. Its kings corresponded with popes and emperors. Its people spoke of Rus not as a memory, but as a mission. From there would later emerge the traditions that helped form the early identity of Ukraine. A Western Rus, proud and distinct, echoing the spirit of Daniel's defiance. The fall of Kiev had not erased its soul. It had merely scattered it, and in that scattering, new nations were born. The political and cultural imprint of the Mongol age stretched far beyond its borders. It altered diplomacy, warfare, architecture, even psychology. Cities learned to fear siege and plan for endurance. Princes learned that survival depended not on might, but on alliances and timing. The steppe had taught them patience, and patience would one day win their freedom. Modern scholars often call this era the forging of Eastern Europe. It was the time when the Russ's people learned to adapt, to balance between East and West, faith and pragmatism, memory and change. The Golden Horde, in all its terror, had unwittingly shaped the very states that would inherit its place. From these lessons rose the Muscovite state, which would, in time, overthrow the horde itself and claim the mantle of leadership. But it would also carry the marks of its teacher: autocracy, centralized power, and the belief that unity must come at any cost. In contrast, Galicia-Volhynia carried another inheritance: openness, trade, and the spirit of resistance. Together, these two legacies, Eastern iron and Western flame, would define the centuries to come. Even now, the echoes of that division linger. In the languages, in the faiths, in the borders of Eastern Europe, one can still trace the fracture line left by the Mongol hooves. Yet through it all runs a single thread: survival. For no empire, no Khan, no conqueror could extinguish the will of a people who refused to forget who they were. The Mongols had conquered bodies, but not memories. They had burned cities, but not faith. And it was faith, in God, in land, in the destiny of Russes, that became the foundation of renewal. From the ruins of Kiev came not only sorrow, but vision. Generations would look back upon that burning city as both warning and inspiration. The warning: division invites destruction. The inspiration: even from ashes, nations can rise again. The lesson would echo across centuries, in the wars of princes, in the rise of kingdoms, in the survival of cultures that refused to fade. Each era would retell the story of Kiev, sometimes as tragedy, sometimes as prophecy, but always as a mirror reflecting what happens when pride, courage, and unity collide with fate. And so the tale of Mongol conquest ends not in silence, but in continuity. From Kiev's ruins came Moscow's throne. From submission came strength. From despair came endurance. And from the long night of the Tatar yoke came the dawn of rebirth. The steppe winds still blow across those ancient rivers. They whisper the names of cities long dead, of princes long forgotten. But they also whisper a truth that history never lets die. Empires fall, nations change, but the spirit that endures, the will to rebuild, to remember, to rise again, is eternal. The ashes of Kiev became the soil of a new world. Thus ends the story of the Mongol invasion of Rus, 1223 to 1240, 17 years that reshaped the destiny of a continent. From the banks of the Kalka to the ruins of Kiev, it was a story not only of conquest, but of transformation. For every city burned, another rose. For every empire that triumphed, another began to awaken beneath it. History's wheel turned, and from its fire, a people were reborn.